I'm Ryan with High Desert Math Tutor, and today I'm going to take a moment to show you how to find the inverse of a function. So there are 3 steps you always have to follow, and one additional step that just depends on where you're starting for finding an inverse function. So step 0 just depends on what you're given. So if the original function you're given starts with f of x equals, instead of saying y equals, the first thing you do is replace f of x with y. After that, these next 3 steps you always follow when finding an inverse function. So you start by switching x and y, you solve for the new y, and in your final answer, you replace that y with f inverse of x. So you know, clearly can tell, anyone can clearly tell that the answer you got is an inverse function. So for this function here, we're starting out with f of x equals x minus 2 cubed plus 7. So we do need to switch this f of x out for y. Now everything else will stay the same. So x minus 2 cubed plus 7. So step 0 is done. Step 1, switch this x and this y. So now we're going to have x equals y minus 2 cubed plus 7. And now we just solve for this y. So as always, when all variables that we're solving for are on one side of the equation, we're going to get rid of everything around this variable by going through the order of operations backwards. So we see we're solving for y. We see that there's addition of 7 over here. So we can get the 7 to go away by doing the opposite of addition, which is subtraction. Whatever we do to one side of the equation, we have to do to the other. So this cancels, and we get x minus 7 equals y minus 2 cubed. Now we see here, there's no more addition or subtraction outside the parentheses, which, by the way, when you're solving an equation for a variable, you typically get rid of whatever's around this variable, working from outside in. So the furthest thing that was being added was a 7. Now outside of the parentheses, there's nothing else being added, subtracted. There's no multiplication or division, but we do see outside the parentheses, there is an exponent. So if you ask, what's the opposite of raising something to the power 3? The opposite of raising something to the power 3 is taking the cube root of something. So if we take the cube root of the right side, so we're plugging this into the cube root. We have to plug this into a cube root also. Now the exponent and the root, those perfectly cancel each other. And all that's left over here is y minus 2. On this side, there's nothing to cancel, so we're just going to have the cube root of x minus 7. But the last thing we have before y is by itself, we have to get rid of minus 2. So the opposite of subtracting 2 is adding 2. So those cancel. But whatever you do to one side of the equation, you do to the other. So we add 2 over here. Now I want to point out really fast that we are adding 2 to this side, but this 2 cannot suddenly go inside this root. That's a mistake many people make, where when they add 2, they try to add 2 to the 7, but notice that this 7 is inside a root. So unless this 2 was inside this cube root before we simplified it, there's no way that we can combine these 2 numbers together. So what's left over, I'm going to move this onto the left side now. So we have y equals all this, the cube root of x minus 7 plus 2. So we've taken care of the algebra where we solved for y, but now to make it clear that this function is an inverse, we're going to say this is f inverse of x. It's the cube root of x minus 7 plus 2. So, step 1, well, step 0 actually. From there to there, step 0. Switching f of x out for y. From here to here, step 1, we replaced the x and the y, we switched positions for them. And then from here all the way down to here was step 2, where we solved for the new value of y. And the final step for finding the inverse function, step 3, was simply replacing y with f inverse of x. But now it's very easy to make mistakes when you're doing this algebra, especially if you're new to solving for inverse functions. So to check our work, all we have to do is plug either the original function into the inverse function, or we plug the inverse function as a whole into the original function. So for no good reason, I'm going to go ahead and plug the original function into the inverse. So if we check our work, this is what we do. So I'm going to take the inverse function and I'm going to plug the original function into it as input. So the inverse function is the cube root of something minus 7 plus 2. I know I don't have a lot of space, so sorry, it's getting a little small. But what we have to plug in for x here is the original function, which is x minus 2 cubed plus 7. Now, if we work through this, we'll see is plus 7 minus 7, those cancel each other out. So what's left inside this cube root is the cube root of x minus 2 cubed plus 2 on the outside. And as we saw over here, if you have a cube root and something being cubed, these cancel each other. So now all that's left is x minus 2 plus 2. And then if you add 2 and you subtract 2, that cancels. And all that's left for our final answer is x. So that's what we would expect. If you plug x into a function, the function does something to x. Well, if you plug that result into an inverse function, this inverse function does the exact opposite of what this just did. So that means if you plug in x, you do something to it, and then you undo it, it ends up just being what it was when you started. So I know that's a bit to process. I'll make another video where I explain more clearly the relationship between a function and its inverse. But for now, I just wanted to show you how to find the inverse of a function.